Kia ora te whānau. Today we're going to talk about the training that I wish I did when I was younger. When I was coming up and playing sport from like school to club, that's kind of the time when most people start training in the gym. As time has progressed and now we have more knowledge, I guess, and more research to show us the benefits of weights training, everything's changed. When I was at high school, a lot of people had no clue. I think people are only just starting to figure it out now in terms of your S&C coaches and people that are at the lead with regards to those sporting teams. So a lot of people didn't really understand what kind of training was going to be beneficial. Even some of the personal trainers that I work with, they had a fair idea, but they still didn't really have any kind of clue that we have now about the best type of training that you should do if you are an aspiring athlete, or even if you're just an athlete that's training for sport. So a lot of the training programs were either bodybuilder influenced or powerlifting influence. And the reason for that is because everyone was doing that at the time, and there wasn't a lot of talk or chatter around what you should do if you're an athlete and how to improve your athletic performance other than just lifting heavy and getting stronger and the carryover that you would get from that. So honestly, I probably wasted a lot of my years doing the wrong types of trainings that would have been good for more of an off season, maybe some of your pre-season type of phase, but going into season, etc., even in that specific pre-season part of your periodization, it would have been a lot better to start transitioning into sport actions, sporting movements, and something really specific for the type of sport that you play. So the first thing that I think would have been way more beneficial for me to focus on, especially in those two periods that I talked about, your specific pre-season and then going into season, mainly at the beginning, would have been unilateral movements. Sorry, the dog is hitting the things and it's freaking me out. I can't think of many other sports other than rowing, weightlifting, I guess powerlifting, CrossFit, where you would be doing bilateral movements. So for example, when you're doing sculls row, I guess your hands cross over a little bit. So they kind of have a little bit of unilateral focus, but more or less you're basically doing bilateral movement the whole time. Both legs are moving at the same time, both arms are moving at the same time, and everything's moving in conjunction simultaneously. Same in weightlifting, when you're lifting the weights, obviously moving bilaterally again, and then powerlifting is pretty much weightlifting, just not ollie lifts. And then you've got your CrossFit where you'll have that weightlifting, Olympic lifting, powerlifting component. So you do some bilateral stuff in there as well. But almost every other sport, and actually drop a sport in the comments down below if you know any more bilateral sports that I didn't list. But every other sport that we play, field-based, your water-based, court-based, all of those sports are all unilateral. There's pretty much only a few instances where you will use both limbs at once to perform any given movement. In rugby, something like a line out when you're jumping and jumping off two legs, I guess, and then lifters as well, kind of doing that pressing and squatting movement. What's another sport? Butterfly, maybe, in swimming. That's a bilateral movement, but then you've got all the other unilateral versions as well. Sorry, I got out of here. So she's supposed to be chiming in any moment now.
I'm doing other stuff.
But yeah, those are probably a few instances within the sports where you would switch to bilateral for a moment, but every other action or movement that you do out on the field, the water, on the court, is usually unilateral. One of the biggest things that I think we overlook with the unilateral movements is obviously the imbalance between both sides of the body. Everyone's got that dominant side. Some people are a little bit lucky and they favor both sides a little more equally, but most of us will have a more dominant side. It's really important that we understand where we're strong, and that comes from how we load. What I wish I did, which I guess I kind of incorporate a little bit now, is I wish I did more loading on my less dominant side. Also allowed myself progressions to move into more explosive movements, and then also just really awkward movements as well that I think go underlooked a lot of the times. For example, the inversion positions of the foot and then the knee. when we're doing running or jumping. I think that we get pushed into this area of everything staying aligned so often that we forget about these other areas that, well, sometimes when you do jump, your knees come in, and sometimes when you run or you land, your foot actually turns into that awkward position. And if it's not used to doing that whilst under fatigue, then obviously that's where we drift into that area of increasing our risk of injury. And this is a nice segue into my next point, utilizing proper load and progression. So one of the biggest problems, especially when you start to get stronger, a lot of athletes do all the bilateral movements like your deadlift, your back squat, your bench press, etc. But when you get strong from those, you feel like your jumps can be a lot bigger in every movement that you do. And this is one of the areas that I went wrong as a youngin', was I tried to jump with weights too fast, which means I'd go from like a 20 kg dumbbell straight up to a 30 kg dumbbell, straight up to a 40, because I just felt like, I can just keep going up by 10 kgs with these movements. But obviously, as I got heavier, my movements started to change and I wasn't doing it exactly the same each time. So if I had it my way again, what I would probably focus more on is making sure that the progressional overload was a little bit slower and allow for that adaptation so that I can maintain my progressions and I can also keep the same technical standards with all of my movements. The other thing with making sure that the progressions are a lot slower is also understanding what progressions come next and how to incorporate explosive stuff into the next progression during that phase. Because ideally, what we want to be doing is we want to increase the body's ability to tolerate high load through that unilateral plane, and then obviously increase that ability whilst we do explosive movements, because that's what we're going to be doing in our sporting arenas. Now, when it comes to loading the body, for me personally, I look at it into different sections of the body. So you've kind of got like the trunk section, and then I guess more proximal part of the limb, and then the real distal part of the limb. So as if we were to like work from the body and then up the arm, we'd have like the torso, then upper arm, then further out as well. And learning how to create different movement patterns and loading patterns for these different areas would have been way more beneficial in terms of then transferring into explosive movements where those parts of my body are being utilized. My third point would definitely be controlling my overtraining. So a lot of the time, especially when I was in Australia playing rugby league, I was definitely training way too much, way more than what I needed to. And so in the last few years, I've really been trying to learn how much is just enough. Because when it comes to athletes, especially elite athletes, the goal is always around how little can I do to get the most amount of gain, because I want to make sure that I'm going to keep improving, but I don't want to be tired or sore or in a compromised position when it comes to my next sporting event or when it comes to my next game. I don't want to interfere with that recovery period, and I also want to put more emphasis on my intensity when it comes to skills-based sessions. And one of the biggest issues that I faced was that when I got to the skills-based session after doing so much load and volume through the week, I would just be too tired to be functioning and performing at a high level. When I was training like that, by Wednesday, from Monday being my first day of the week in terms of training, by Wednesday, I would have done already 10 hours of training because I would have done 3 hours training on the Monday night for football, 3 again on the Wednesday night, and then 4 to 5 hours of training in the mornings for those days as well. So it was just overkill. You really don't need to train that much. You can train that much, but you also need a lot of rest and recovery. So your sleep needs to be maxing out around that 9-hour mark, definitely, to keep you recovering well. And the trainings need to be super specific. So there really was no reason for me to be doing so much weights training. Probably needed to do more stuff around mobility and prehab, and obviously rehab as well, to keep my body in a more resilient position. And this way we'd be able to perform really well when it came to all the team-based stuff and the skills-based stuff. And my last tip would definitely be managing variation in your training. This is something that, because I guess the hype at the moment is just always something different, always something new, trying not to be bored. And that's reflected through everything that we do with regards to like being on social media, all the different things we get to see on Netflix and all those other platforms, YouTube, etc. But it's always about being new and being different and trying to keep you interested. But unfortunately, when it comes to your training, the stuff that's the most repetitive is the stuff that you get really good at. You've got to keep a hold on variation in your training. So we don't want too much variation, and it takes around 3 to 4 weeks to actually start to see adaptation occur. So we don't really want to be changing up what we do all the time too often. You can have variations of the movements that are quite similar. For example, if you do your compound lift, say like a back squat first, and then we're going to do a unilateral version of squatting. So we can do like a lunge. The next week we could switch those lunges out for step ups. And then the next week we could switch those step ups out for Bulgarians. And you could do this version of it, and that provides a little bit of variation, but if you really want to make it super specific, keeping the same type of program week in, week out with manipulations in intensity instead, which is obviously like your load or how many reps, etc., is a better way to do it because the adaptations are a little bit quicker. And obviously you adapt to those movements that you're doing. So if those movements are specific to your sport, then it's probably even more important to keep continuing to do them. So if you are an aspiring athlete, or even if you're someone that's just joining up to a gym, there's actually some real good gems in there about what you should do with regards to your training when you're trying to reach a specific goal. And obviously these pieces of advice are best suited to people who are aspiring athletes, or even people who are just athletes that want to restructure their training. But you can utilize some of these different techniques in your own training. And basically it's just keep it simple, don't overdo it, and make sure that you have an understanding of why you would do a session. Anyways guys, I hope you enjoy the video. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. Please like, please share, and please subscribe. If you want to check out any more content like this, or you need to DM us your questions about how this relates to you, head over to The Collective Training over on Instagram, and you can DM us today. If you made it this far in the video, you know what to do.
Drop your sword
Down in the comments below. Thank you so much for your support, team. Let's go.